I'm going to talk about the different aspects of attribute-based access control implementation. John is going to talk about the U.S. Army project itself, and we'll have some time for Q&A, and we are here, at least you're here at least today, and maybe tomorrow, and I'm here at least until Thursday, so we are available for questions as well. So quick introduction, Noam Dror. I run sales engineering at NextLabs. I have a long experience with identity and access management in different fields, really advising customers on different aspects of identity and access management and the complexities in it. John?
And I'm John Andrukonis. I work for Accenture Federal Services and the lead on the NextLabs project at the Army. So I have to speak here today on behalf of AFS, don't represent the Army, but kind of speak to what's been keys to our success on that program and bring some of that back to you all.
Yeah. So starting with some simple explanation of ABAC. Hopefully it's simple and hopefully it's known. So this is a generic XACML implementation of attribute-based access control or any kind of general access management solution, right? That if I like to start from the bottom where you manage those policies. You have your information point, your directories, where you store your policies and your PRPs. Then you have your policy decision point, where you make the decision to allow or deny access, and your enforcement point. So that's kind of the basics of it. If you're new to this space, I would recommend to read a NIST article called Special Publication 800-162. That's the best practices guide for attribute-based access control. And you should also look at the URL at the bottom. It's part of the NIST Center of Excellence, Cyber Center of Excellence, where we did a nice lab with NIST on how to enforce, how to deploy attribute-based access control. So those are good kind of resources just to read about ABAC in general. So ABAC is great for controlling access to data in different applications. But it's also great in integrating with other identity and access management services. So some of those services is, how do I simplify my identity management projects, right? So one of the big pain points of identity management is the designing of roles, provisioning of roles, provisioning to hundreds of thousands of group memberships, or provisioning to groups within Unix, Linux systems. That's one of the big challenges of identity management projects. So if you have attribute-based access control, it makes it a lot easier and simpler to provision access to systems, because now instead of provisioning group membership to millions of groups, I just have a few attributes that I need to manage, which makes it a lot easier. Of course, then certification becomes easier, because when you need to recertify access on a monthly or quarterly or yearly basis, I don't need to certify 1 million group memberships, right? It becomes a lot easier to certify the policies and then to certify the attributes. So that makes it a lot easier. Another new component that comes into play is, in general, context-based authorization. More specifically, you can actually do segregation of duties in real time. So for example, if I created an invoice and now I want to pay it, because we can make a decision in real time, I can make an SOD authorization here to say, oh, sorry, you cannot create an invoice and pay it because you might be paying yourself. Or I can say, excuse me, Mr. User, you're violating an SOD policy. Do you understand and accept the risk, yes or no? So it makes SOD a lot easier within the implementation. Then, of course, the risk aware. So attribute can be anything. Attribute can be a user attribute. It can be a resource attribute regarding what is that data. But it can also be contextual or environmental attributes. So that can be time of day, location, IP addresses. It can also be a risk score. So if you're very big in your environment on UBA, UEBA, any kind of risk authentication, you can calculate that risk into an authorization decision. So if I'm in an insurance company and I'm going to process a claim that is $1 million, maybe I should look at if this is a risky user. Did that user did some unusual behavior lately that I should deny that processing that $1 million claim? Right, so that's kind of advantage you can get from attribute-based access control. Last but not least, we really love getting integrated attribute-based access control into IAM core services. So a good example would be for PAM, right? So if you have privileged access management, again, you would have millions of roles to say who can do what, especially when you go into secure shell. I don't know how many of you are using some secure shells and what you can do within the shell once you are a privileged user. That would require a lot of permissions, a lot of roles. That can make life a lot more simple. Same thing for SSO, so your coarse-grained access control. Your WAM solutions can definitely use that and make dynamic decisions based on that. And we see more and more the need for customer identity and access management, or IDaaS in general. How do I delegate permissions to my partners to allow them to do just a few things in my system, right? So if you look at IDaaS industry today in general, you'll see that they're doing a great job in authenticating using standards like SAML and OAuth to authenticate users into the applications. But what needs to mature a little bit more is how do I authorize my mid-level users? So maybe I have a partner, an agency, insurance agency, that needs to do something more than an end user. How do I provide them those permissions? And that's a great fit for attribute-based access control. So now let's go to John and understand a little bit about what was the Army project and how we could leverage the technology. Oh, no, there's one more, sorry. I have one more slide. Some of the things we learned from different attribute-based access control projects. First is it's about attribute quantity. It's about attribute quality and not quantity. So we usually see about 5 attributes. That's the average that we see in a normal project. Those are the attributes that would make the decision on why people should have access. Those are usually defined by what's your line of business, what's your geography, and what's your job description. Those are the main attributes that we're looking for to make a decision to allow or deny. So it's very important to make sure that those attributes are correct and someone is actually governing and administering those attributes. So that's an important part. Then policy management. You need to make sure that you have smart policies, and you shouldn't have more than 100 policies in your environment when you talk about attribute-based access control. That's another huge benefit. Again, going from, we have a customer with more than 2 million roles that cost them about 1.5 million euros a year to maintain those roles. When you go to 100 policies, that's a big difference, right, in cost and in efficiencies. Reusability, the nice thing about attribute-based access control, that it doesn't have to be specific for one application or for one implementation. If the data is the same and the users are the same, I can take the same kind of policies from one application to another. So as long as you have some sort of an abstract layer to say, hey, this is the type of data and those are the type of users, then I can later on translate what is this type of data in this specific application, right? So the reusability is important here. Data quality. So it's important to understand what data we're trying to protect. So in a lot of sensitive environment, you might have classification. I need to know if this is top secret data. I need to know if this is PCI-related data. I need to know if this is PII, right, for complying with different privacy regulations. So it's important to understand what is the data, and you can have different tools to help you understand what is that data. DLP tools can do that, different patterns matching tools can do that. So there are different tools to understand what is the data. Once we know something, attributes or metadata about the data we're trying to protect, it's a lot easier to protect it. And then, even though we are saying attribute-based access control is the next generation of authorization, that doesn't mean that we hate or we think that role-based access control should not be used. So we see a huge advantage layering role-based access control together with attribute-based access control. So most systems today leverage role-based access control to make decisions, which is great. Let's just use attribute-based access control on top of role-based access control to protect the sensitive data. So that's more of a sensible project, right? If you're going to replace role-based access control, that's a very large project if you're replacing something. If you're building from scratch, it's a different question. But most applications out there are using role-based access control, and therefore you want to make sure that you're layering that. Last but not least, we see a big value of protecting files together with data with inside applications. So think about your file protection strategy and see how you can layer attribute-based access control together with protecting those files, because those files have the same data that you have in your critical applications, right? If I have my ERP system and I'm downloading my customer list or my financial statements, the same data is now in a file. So why wouldn't I use the same policy to protect it? Make sense? So now let's try to understand how that applies to US Army.
Thanks, Noam. So you'll see, I'll start off here with a little background of where our project came from and kind of the problem statement behind it. But a lot of the points that Noam brought up, we've applied here, and you'll kind of see throughout. So I'll try and touch on those as we go through. But we started working, AFS started working with the Army about 2 years ago, and the problem that they presented us was how to restrict organizational information at a more granular level within SAP. So if a lot of you are familiar with SAP, it can be challenging to restrict organizationally within the system out of the box. There are data elements you can use, but they're not very consistent throughout the environment. And it can be challenging to get down to a more granular level. At the Army, we needed to be able to provide each command the ability to define what the need to know was for their organizations and make sure that only those organizations had access to view that. And that was across all of their business processes within, for us it was ECC, which is the main instance of SAP, their primary financial environment. And that was a challenge because we looked at a lot of the players in the game and ones that integrated well with SAP, and there weren't a lot in that space. And NextLabs was one of the few that had an SAP product for ABAC control. And so we worked with NextLabs and the Army, and we put together a proof of concept, showed that this concept could work. And then we kind of went from there and moved forward. Part of the reason we went forward with this approach was some of the reasons that Noam mentioned earlier. So we focused on easeability to maintain. They have an existing financial system that they need to integrate well with, so it was important that the security solution that we applied could play well with other SAP environments, integrate back, they could sync their data, all of those sorts of things were important to them. So having a system that layered on top and didn't completely change our security framework was important. It was also very important in a community that hasn't used this tool before that it work very similarly and be straightforward, transparent, so that they understood why they didn't and did not have access to things. SAP can be a little funny when you're using it out of the box as to why you're getting denied for certain actions. With this solution, it was very clear why I might be denied from something organizationally versus something more action-based or role-based security. So the slide coming up here, which will go into more detail on that. But that was one of the major benefits to this for us, was our ability to leverage our existing role solution and layer this ABAC control on top of it. So this is kind of the diagram that I think well illustrates how we layer this on and the different security measures that the Army needed and kind of how this ABAC was kind of the last piece of that. So if you've ever worked in the DoD space, you're probably familiar with the CAC card, the Common Access Card. That's kind of that first layer of security. So that's the physical security to get into the system. Then beyond that, the first 3 layers here are really already existing. So these are things we were able to just pull from the Army's existing solutions. Enrolled in SAP, they have an existing identity access management solution. They use GRC. We're still using that today. We're able to integrate that with NextLabs as well, and I'll go into that in more detail a little bit in a minute. And then the third layer here is you see assigned specific transactions or reports. Those are your traditional role-based security. So we were able to, like I said, leverage what we had before. We didn't have to do a complete role redesign. We just took what they had, slim that down to specifically the functions that they needed for this project, but really used what they had as a template and moved forward with that. So the last and most important piece of this project and for this program, for the Army dealing in this sensitive areas that they do, was the NextLabs piece that controlled the organizational attributes that they had. So when you have organizations working in the field and at different commands around the world, it's critical that nothing is disclosed. I mean, this is a very unique situation, and I'll talk about our challenges later, but I mean, any spillage of data across the system is a big deal for them, and that was one of our challenges early on, is we felt like if the commands and the communities that we were dealing with saw any data that they weren't privileged to, that would go right up the chain, and that would be a failure of the system. So this granularity of control that we were able to get with NextLabs was critical to this solution, and 80% really didn't cut it. So in terms of our challenges and takeaways, so Noam mentioned earlier about limiting the number of attributes in the system and limiting the number of policies you have in the system. So this was a critical piece for us. Like I mentioned, a lot of the community is not familiar with SAP or other ERPs. A lot of this had been done offline previously. So we needed a system that they could easily select roles. I mentioned we use GRC. So today the system is the same. They go in, they select their role-based security, and they select their attribute-based security, their organizational roles at the same time. We were able to limit those attributes to just one in the system. So we're only using one anywhere where we don't have that in the system or it's not directly available. We've worked with NextLabs, our Army counterparts, and worked to determine that. So a lot of times we have to kind of go through a little derivation to figure out what that attribute is in that scenario. But the extra design effort in those circumstances is paid out tenfold later on in testing and user adoption, because people understand what they're controlled on. When it's just one thing, I can go back at the end of the year when our organizations go through and validate who has access to what. They say, here are my organizations, here's my list of users that are in it. I know these people, I don't know these people, and they can certify them like that very easily versus the complexity that may come with having multiple attributes and complex policies. We have somewhere under 10 policies, but it really breaks down to just one policy that, with some sub-policies that kind of defines unique scenarios, but it's pretty straightforward. So the diagram here on the bottom right of the slide goes into one of our biggest challenges that we've had testing this product and working with the Army to make sure that it is secure and that we don't have spillages, is that for those of you who are familiar with SAP, you know how integrated a lot of these transactions are. You can jump from one place to the other. You don't always know where you're jumping to. I'll give you the example of like a purchase order. If you were to pull that up in SAP, you can enter the transaction directly, search for that number, and it'll come up. You could also run a purchase order report, go to it from there. Or you may be on an invoice and you may be clicking the originating document, and that's how you navigate back to it. So those all represent different doors that you can get to the transaction. That's kind of what the graphic here is meant to represent. The office is creating and maintaining a purchase order, but there are a lot of different ways to get there and do that. The challenge we had was making sure we had a NextLabs validation and check at all those doors. So that's here as security guard. NextLabs is effectively that security guard. So we've gone through and done a lot of testing, and the challenge here is that generally when you're doing testing, I know this is a security community, but when you're doing functional testing, you're doing security testing, you're kind of operating silos. You get your security team, they give you a role, you test it, you say, oh, yeah, I can do what I need to do. The functional team says, yeah, I can do what I need to do, and they move on from there. But that's not how this testing has to work. I mean, we had to look at every possible action you could take in any given transaction, and test all of those circumstances, because end users will do a lot of crazy things that you never imagined possible. And if you don't test all of those, you will have spillage in the system. And again, that's going to hurt the adoption and hurt the usage of the tool. But so those are some of the major takeaways that we had.
So maybe for that, it's important to separate between the PEP, where you have multiple ways to get access to the data, that's what you tested, versus having one PEP. You have one policy that defines all of those different doors. So actually the different doors as you see here is what they need to test, but there's only one policy that actually protects the entire room.
Exactly, and that's a great point to bring up, because as I mentioned earlier, this is where limiting your policies and limiting your attributes really comes into play. And this is something Noam and I were talking about last night as well, is we spent a lot of time working with the Army and making sure that this one attribute would work, because the benefits were huge. I mean, you can imagine here I have 4 doors, and this is a pretty real life example. I have 4 doors. If I have 2 attributes, that's 8 ways I have to test. If I have 2 attributes and 2 different policies that might be affected in different ways, now I've got basically 2 to the third. That's, we're going up from there. But it might be 16 different ways to test. My math might be a little shaky up here, but it does grow exponentially as you increase your policies and increase your attributes. And that's not just in the test phase that affects you, that also affects you during provisioning, and it affects you during validation at the end of year, and all of your troubleshooting, your cost to maintain your system. So limiting those and simplifying those really pays off in the long run. And the last point I'll make here is that I think in the future of security and this ABAC solution as well, it's incredibly important to integrate your functional and technical and security teams. We have had in the past on larger ERP implementations pretty siloed teams. You'd have your functional team saying, this is what I need a role to do. They'd give that to the security team. They'd build it. They'd send it back. The functional team would say, hey, okay, I need this requirement built. They'd send it to the technical team. They would come back and build it. This ABAC security solution and security solutions moving forward in sensitive environments and sensitive communities really need to have a more holistic approach. And we've had to really integrate our teams to look at, not just should I have access to this, should I not have access to this, but what does it mean to have access to this information, and what does it mean to apply a policy like this in this circumstance? So it's really integrated our teams a lot more, and I think put us more in a security mindset across our larger teams on this program.
Perfect. And by the way, we didn't coordinate the suits. Just a coincidence. So, questions? What do you think? Yeah, go ahead.
What was the mechanism or the hook that allowed you to put your policy query between the doorway and the app?
So, how did we enforce? How did we enforce inside SAP?
So NextLabs has, there are customer enhancement spots throughout SAP, and so NextLabs uses a lot of those, and I believe you guys also have a relationship with them to add them in situations where they didn't exist previously, but I don't think we've even had those cases yet. They've all been customer enhancement points that existed in SAP today, and then that's being rolled into the PSSM product, so those will become standard checks or standard gateways, I'll say.
Yeah.
So for the attribute that you guys collected to do that authorization, did those attributes already exist, or did you have to go and create them in order to create that container to verify again?
Yeah, it was important for us to use attributes that already existed, or an attribute that already existed, because we had a community that has used SAP, was familiar with it, so they, to be a part of the decision-making process, really had to understand what that meant financially for them in terms of the information that they could see. So it was an attribute that existed.
Yeah.
Is there a fear that SAP can do the same thing? They already had one level of security. You guys have kind of fit into that space. Is this something that's going to make them wake up and add this in themselves? How does that fit in something like your company?
Maybe I'll answer that. In the case of SAP, it's less likely because we are already partnering in them, but it can definitely happen in any solution. But I don't think it matters for the customer side, because if you get the same kind of capabilities, then you get the same capabilities. You just need to manage your attributes and see how you can enforce them, right?
Do folks on the other side of the room have questions? I don't want to just optimize for not walking.
Oh, yeah.
Going once, going twice.
I look here. Go ahead.
Are we looking at extending ABAC outside of SAP? Was that part of the use case, or is that something that is underway or maybe
Probably can't talk too much about the other things that they're looking into, but the implementation today was just SAP.
Classified.
One question that the attributes may reside from different systems, right? What will be used for your ABAC? So how you make the synchronization, or all the attributes stays in the SAP system itself?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Okay, so when we say about ABAC, you require the attributes which are already available.
Right.
That attributes may fall down from the different data stores or reference systems. So how the synchronization were done? Because as a policy being, PEP, and I'm using that system, my attributes may change.
Right. So there are roles defined in GRC with those attributes. So essentially it's kind of get exported to GRC a little bit. So those attributes are in the main ECC system, and then those get pushed to or pulled in GRC, and the organizations themselves define what those attributes are. So if a new attribute rolled out, I had a new segment of my organization, I would work with the role team existing, the security team today, build that role in GRC, and then I would be able to provision that out to my user base. And then GRC pushes for us ECC and BW. So
GRC is a semi-identity and access management system from SAP. So it can actually manage the attribute and push the attribute and do different things to it. So they're leveraging those capabilities.
I have a question on how you integrated your rules into your CI/CD processes. So do you do automated testing and release of your new ABAC policies?
We have some automated testing, not specifically around this. There are some situations that we've chosen to automate from some of our retesting, but it's not been a big part of this implementation.
And then, did you have any, in terms of operability, did you have any visibility into, if rules are executed or which rules are fired for which use cases? Do you ever have to troubleshoot that in a production system?
Reporting and auditing.
So there's reporting in the DAM module, so that's like the main component in the control center. You can see where the violations were caused, what got denied, who got denied. So you can go back and validate that. We are not in production yet, so that part we haven't done in production yet, but that is something we're doing in test phase as a part of this, is validating those logs. So.
Got time for one more question. Again, want to make sure I'm not totally ignoring the side of the room I can't walk to. Anyone? 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 Cool. Thank you.
Right
very
on
much.
time. Thank you so much, guys. Thanks.